Good evening, everyone. And welcome. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Small, and I'm a trustee of the Friends of the South Downs. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this talk by Chris Hare and to introduce Chris. I will do that in just a moment, but first, I am obliged to say something briefly about the Friends. Hopefully, we'll all be familiar with us, or at least have heard of us. We were founded in 1923 as the Society of Sussex Downsmen, before later becoming the South Downs Society, and now we go by the name of the Friends of the South Downs. We are the only membership organisation dedicated to the conservation and enhancement of the South Downs National Park, and we run both events and walk programmes, comment on planning applications, support various projects that align with our aims and objectives. And if you're not already a member, then do please consider joining us and supporting our work. Now, more importantly, to introduce our speaker for this evening, Chris Hare. Chris is well known to the Friends for his work with us on various projects, including South Downs Generations and South Downs for All, the latter of which provides opportunities for primary school children from mainly disadvantaged areas within and around the national park to experience and learn about the cultural heritage of the South Downs. However, Chris may be known to you as a local historian and educator. He has a Bachelor of Arts with honours in British Studies and a Master of Arts in Life History, Oral History, and Mass Observation. In his career, Chris has been a continuing education tutor at the Centre of Continuing Education at the University of Sussex, Devon Adult Education Manager, West Sussex Adult Education Manager, and Climate Change Officer for West Sussex County Council. In 2009, Chris established History People UK and has been continuously busy writing funding applications and managing heritage projects ever since, all with great success. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Martin, and good evening, everyone. So, yes, I'm going to talk to you for the next 50 minutes or so about Richard Jefferies. Um, he's a man I've known of for a long time, and I've read many of his books and essays. And earlier this year, as part of a series of Heritage Trail leaflets published by the Worthy Heritage Alliance, we produced one on Jefferies. So I will actually be reading from quotes from this leaflet as we go through the talk. Um, Here's a picture of Jefferies, probably taken, it's from a photograph, an engraving from a photograph of probably about 1885. And you'd have seen from the introductory slide that his life was comparatively short. Born in 1848, died in 1887. Before his 39th birthday, he was only 38. So a short life, but a huge and prodigious output of essays and books about the English countryside, about country life, country people, also novels, also observations about social conditions in which the rural population lived. Now, Jefferies was born in the little village of Cote, not far from Swindon in Wiltshire in 1848. His father owned a small farm. They weren't the poorest people, but they certainly weren't wealthy either. He was quite a lonely child. He liked to wander down by the river, amongst the trees and through the fields. And he read. He read a great deal. And though his father was not an educated man, he was familiar with the great literary writers of England, including Shakespeare. So young Richard grew up knowing these things. So he was a sort of outsider, really, in terms of class. You couldn't say he was middle class, but neither could you say he was working class. He was educated, but to a large degree educated in the school of life. He didn't go to university or anything like that. Um, and when he was still a teenager, he wrote a letter to the Times about the condition of the agricultural labourers in Wiltshire that was published. And this was the start, really, of a journalistic career. He worked for the local newspaper in Wiltshire, and then gradually the London magazines picked up on him. Now, when we're talking about the 1870s, 1880s, and there was a wide readership for weekly and monthly journals amongst the urban middle class who were fascinated, enthralled, but also at the same time slightly apprehensive about the countryside and the people who lived there. And so here was Jefferies, their interpreter. They loved his nature writing. They weren't quite sure about his politics, and they were sort of really quite bemused by some of his more philosophical writings, which I think would have sat quite neatly into the philosophy and vibe of the 1960s rather than the 1870s and 1880s. So, for instance, Jeffrey's autobiography, The Story of My Heart, isn't a series of chapters about his life. It's a series of chapters about experiences he'd had, esoteric, naturalistic, spiritual experiences, which didn't sit easily with a Victorian audience. This is his wife, Jessie, and it's important to mention her because, as you probably surmised, the fact that he died at 38 didn't suggest he was in robust health. And really, throughout his life, he was poorly. He'd have moments where he'd regain his strength and then he'd lose it again. So she was far more than just a support in terms of enabling him to work. She was also an inspiration. And at the very end of his life, when he was so poorly that he literally couldn't write, he dictated to her and she wrote it down. So I think we ought to be mindful that probably, certainly some of Jeffrey's later output can be seen as a combined effort with Jessie. Um, Now, what's the Sussex, what's the South Downs connection? You may be thinking, well, this is interesting, this man of Wiltshire. Well, the connection is that in that because of his work for these London-based magazines, the Pall Mall Gazette, the 19th Century, um, he was more and more located in London, but London really didn't agree with a man of the countryside. And as his health deteriorated, he moved not back to Wiltshire, but to Sussex, because Sussex was still, of course, at that time, very, very rural, but much closer to London. And as long as he was somewhere with a railway station, he could get up to London, meet with editors, meet with book publishers, and so forth. So he moved to Crowborough, and then from Crowborough he moved to Hove, to Lorna Road in Hove, and finally to the little village of Goring by Sea. Now today, Goring by Sea is a suburb of Worthing, but when Jeffreys arrived, it was very much a separate village 2 miles to the west of Worthing. You go there today, if you know it, it's just it is a big suburb, but there are little remnants, tiny remnants of the village that remain, and appropriately, one of those remnants is this little lane, Jeffreys Lane. Obviously, it wasn't known that at the time. It's been renamed after him, and here is the house in which he died in August 1887. And you can probably observe on the slide there's a blue plaque that was put up actually in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, when people were starting to appreciate the importance of Richard Jefferies and his contribution to rural literature. So I'm going to go through now and give you some selections of his writings, and of course, this can only be a flavour. I would encourage you to get hold of his books, his essays, and read them for yourself. And as I said, there'll be a number of links that will appear on my presentation. And Eloise has said that she'll email them out to everybody. So if you don't pick them up during the course of my presentation, you will get them by email. One of them is a short video that I made a few years ago about Richard Jefferies' novel After London, and I think you'd find that interesting to look at. So here's a photograph. I expect some of you will know where this is. It's Devil's Dyke, but it's Devil's Dyke in 1885. So absolutely at the time when Jefferies would have known it and would have visited it and would have been living at Lorna Road in Hove. So let's read about what Jefferies said about the South Downs. And of course, we must remember this was a very, different South Downs to our South Downs. It was overwhelmingly downland turf with hundreds of thousands of sheep, whereas today most of the Downs has been put over to agriculture, to food production. So you can't roam freely like he did. He just could walk in any direction over downland turf. There were not the fences, there were not the fields, there were not the crops. But for a man who suffered from ill health and a man who felt very stressed, really, by the necessity of being in the huge city of London, it was a great thing to find himself on the South Downs. And he wrote as he walked up onto the Downs, at each step, the yoke of artificial life lightens on the shoulder, and at the summit falls away. The heart beats faster being free, and the mind opens to the opening horizon. So intimately are the body and the mind bound together that as the one climbs, the other aspires. And on the ridge we walk on a level ground above our old selves, left beneath us. And although he wasn't an archaeologist, archaeology was only in its infancy anyway in his lifetime, nor was he an historian. He seemed to have a sense of the past, an understanding of the ancientness of many of the features he observed, including the ancientness of this downland turf. So he wrote, "The sword is the original sword, untouched, unploughed, centuries old. It is that which was formed when the woods that covered the hills were cleared, whether by British tribes whose markings are still to be found, but by Roman smiths, by Saxon settlers, or however it came about in the process of years. Probably the trees would grow again were it not for the sheep, but these preserve the sword. The plough has nibbled at it and gnawed away great slices, but it extends mile after mile. These are mere touches on its breadth. It is as wild can be, without deer or savage beasts. The bees like it, and the finches come. It is silent and peaceful, like the sky above." But he was also enchanted by the woodland. And he understood what a huge landscape difference there was between the South Downs and the Weald. Um, and the South Downs, as he suggests in that last extract, uh, were far more open than they are today. All of us have probably noticed in our lifetimes how the woodland has gradually come back onto the downs as the sheep have disappeared. Those parts of the downs that are not under cultivation, the scrubs come back, and even quite mature trees. So there was the woodland of the Weald, but there was also the woodland on the coastal plain. Um, Whereas today the coastal plain is basically houses. From New Haven to Bognor, there's hardly a patch, is there, where you can find a field or a wood. So it's worth remembering Jefferies' time, although the towns were growing and developing, nothing on the scale that we've seen in our times. And if you enjoyed going onto the downs in the spring and the summer, he resorted to the woods in the winter, perhaps woods not far from where he was living. And so here's a description of him being in the woods early in January, in the winter, as the day is fading. The daylight has lingered on longer than expected, but now the gloom of the short January evening is settling down fast in the wood. The silent and motionless trees rise out of a mysterious shadow which fills up the spaces between the trunks. There rises a loud though distant clamour of rooks and daws who have restlessly moved in their roost trees. Darkness is almost on them, yet they cannot quite settle. The cawing and the dawing rises to a pitch and then declines. the wood is silent, and it is suddenly night. Uh, Now, I mentioned about his spirituality and and how some of his writings uh, was really beyond the scope of many of his readers of his day. Um, and an example here is when he's talking about people, different types of people, and different types of trees. And he's associating the experience of some trees with the lives of people. The lost leaves measure our years. They are gone as the days are gone, and the bare branches silently speak of a new year, slowly advancing to its buds, its foliage and fruit. Deciduous trees associate with human life as the yew never can. Clothed in its yellow greenish needles, its tarnished green, it knows no hope or sorrow. It is indifferent to winter and does not look forward to summer. With their annual loss of leaves and renewal, oak and elm and ash and beech seem to stand by us and share our thoughts. Um, he talks about the weather, about the seasons. Um, Now, this is something I often mention when I do talks to local history societies and talks at history festivals. Our climate, is it changing? Has it changed? Well, I don't think there's any doubt that our winters have changed. Jefferies, and not just Jefferies, but many of his contemporaries, talk about the harsh winters that afflicted the South Downs during the 19th century. Much milder winters, of course, than you get in East Anglia or the north of England. But I know by my work with, for instance, school logbooks, where school head teachers kept a daily record of school life and the number of times schools will be closed because of harsh weather. So this is a photograph again in Jefferies' time, January 1881, and you see here the high street at Lewes piled up with snow. Now that was a particularly harsh winter, and Jefferies wrote of what he called the dread snow tempest, and how not only was there a heavy fall of snow, but it was accompanied by high winds. So, in other words, there was this great blizzard that blasted across the South Downs in the middle of January 1881. And he said, even the most experienced countrymen, and you couldn't get more experienced than shepherds, got lost because they simply couldn't see their hand in front of them because of these appalling conditions. And Jefferies tells us that some 20 to 30 people perished up on the downs because they couldn't find their way to safety. And then he gives this anecdote that we may wonder about its accuracy. It may have been anecdotal, but he records it anyway about when the thaw came. A wagoner and his lad ascended the downs, perhaps the first time they'd taken that route for several weeks because of the conditions, and the snow had melted away, and they see this scarecrow in a field. But when they come up to it, they see it's actually a man still leaning on his shepherd's crook, all withered, with the eyes picked out from the skull by the crows. Now, whether that actually happened or was possible, the fact that he relates it suggests that it wasn't. It was something that people found credible, and that reminds us again how open, wild, and as Jeffrey says, open, wild, and succourless the country was. You could just walk and walk and walk, even in the summer, because there weren't the hedges, because there weren't the fields. You could get lost. But if you were up there in those sort of blizzard conditions, you were really in a desperate situation. Um, so this idea of the Downs being half wild and wholly tame, it's not a barren wilderness. It's not even Dartmoor, but it's somewhere in between. And I think we have to contrast, therefore, Jeffrey's attitude to the countryside with his knowledge of London. He had to acknowledge that London had given him a standard of living. So, although by the mid 1880s he's not a well man, he is reasonably affluent. He's able to live a much better lifestyle than the one he grew up in, and that's all through his writing, and principally through these prestigious journals, these magazines that he wrote for. So he needed to go to London. Um, but in one of his essays, he says that when he was growing up, even though his little village was less than 80 miles from London, it could have been 8,000 miles away for the amount of interaction there was between his part of Wiltshire and the great metropolis. So he wrote, "Often and often I rambled up to the milestone which stood under an oak to look at the chipped inscription low down, to London, 79 miles. So far away, you see, that the very inscription was cut at the foot of the stone, since no one would be likely to want that information. It was half hidden by docks and nettles, despised and unnoticed. A broad land is 79 miles. How many meadows, hedges, and woods in that distance? Wide enough to seclude any house, to hide it like an acorn in the grass. Those who have lived all their lives in remote places do not feel the remoteness. Then I used to feel that it really was 79 miles to London, and not an hour or two by rail. Really, all those miles, a great broad province of green furrow and ploughed furrow between the old house and the city of the world. But the city of the world called him, and as I said, there was a period of time when he was spending much, if not most, of his time there. And although he tried to engage with London, the bustle of London, he was certainly fascinated by the movement of huge numbers of people and the noise. So we may think, oh, well, there wasn't motor traffic, but there was great noise in London because the horse-drawn vehicles with their iron rims on their wheels, the iron horseshoes on the cobbles, hundreds and thousands of these vehicles. It was actually very noisy. And all the street shouts of London, all the hawkers and the vendors, so different to the world he'd grown up in. And his frustration with this is demonstrated in something he wrote shortly before he left for Sussex. He said, "The dust of London fills the eyes and blurs the vision, but it penetrates deeper than that. There is the dust that chokes the spirit, and it is this that makes the streets so long, the stones so stony, the desk so wooden." Um, and the country people, these were the people he'd grown up amongst. So whereas later writers could romanticize country living, could portray characters in their novels whom they'd never known or had only known from afar, to Jefferies, these were real people, and he saw them warts and all. He could talk of their qualities, but he also knew uh, those aspects of their lives that were not so praiseworthy. What did strike him in his lifetime, and just to remind ourselves, we're talking here about the 1870s and the 1880s. Agriculture was in a state of acute depression. One of the reasons there was so much open downland was because agriculture wasn't thriving. If it was, then certainly the lower slopes of the downs would have been cultivated, but cheap imports were flooding in from America. After the end of the American Civil War in 1865, the triumph of the North, the industrialization of American agriculture, cheap imports on a vast scale came into the country. But this was offset, of course, by Britain's own industrial capacity and the growth of cities, the growth of the middle class. So, whereas the agricultural depression of the 1820s had been noticed by all, and there were the swing riots and great agitation, in many ways, the depression of the 1870s did not attract so much attention, and the unemployed of the countryside simply moved into the towns. So gradually, the countryside appeared as if it was being depopulated. And Jefferies writes about this. In fairly good times, the wages of the operatives are not equal to what is earned by those who live in more populous places. In bad seasons, if wages do not exactly decline, the amount of labour is sensibly less. Hard necessity compels the farmer to do with as little as he can, and as the farmers are the only employers, when all the tenants for miles around follow this course, it begins to tell on the cottagers. I have heard of as many as 40 men being idle in one hamlet, hanging about with nothing to do. When upon a lack of work bread price rises, the effect is easy to understand, and unless it falls, there will be hard times this winter. So if he could see what was happening that was not good, he could also see things that were happening that were encouraging. And one thing that really encouraged him was the growing literacy of the rural population, uh, completely different from his childhood. He said, if you had given a cottager a newspaper a few years since, he would have been silent and looked glum. If you give him one now, he says thank you briskly. He and his read anything and everything, and as he walks beside the wagon, he will pick up a scrap of newspaper from the roadside and pore over it as he goes. Girls in service send home papers from London. So do lads when from home, and so many are away from home now. Um, so there is this recognition of how hard it is to earn a decent living in the countryside. Impossible in some ways, and that's why both young men and young women are leaving the countryside and going to work in the towns and the cities. Many of them, of course, never to return. But he is fascinated by this growth in literacy and by the proliferation of newspapers. So his era, 1870s and 1880s, is in some ways the start of the golden age of local newspapers. Now, sadly, we're seeing the decline of local newspapers, the closing of local newspapers, the fall in circulation. And I don't know about people listening to this talk, but certainly where I live in Worthing, there is the Worthing Herald, but it's published in Portsmouth and there's no Worthing office. By the 1880s, there were three local newspapers in Worthing, all published in the town, and it was only a small town. And the county newspapers as well, the West Sussex County Times, the West Sussex Gazette, the West Sussex Weekly Advertiser, and then there are all the little pamphlets that have been produced. Some of them very political, some of them very radical, some of them fomenting change and making people think, well, the lives we live could be different. And I think there's a parallel we can draw between the proliferation of the printed word in the 1880s and our times of the internet, and the concern people have today about fake news. And there was the same concern in the 1880s. Oh, the poor are learning to read, but what are they reading? Is it accurate? Will it stir them up into a revolutionary fervour? But to Jefferies, this was all good. And he wrote, the change is, however, steadily proceeding wherever the printing press is used. No pope, no Kaiser, no Tsar, no Sultan can keep it out. All powerless against a bit of printed paper. bits of printed paper that listen to no command, to which none can say, "Stand back, thou shalt not enter." They rise on the summer whirlwinds from the vast dust of the road and float over the highest walls. They fall on the well-kept lawns. Monastery, prison, palace, there is no fortress against a bit of printed paper. And the lives of women. Jefferies uh, writes a lot about the country women, uh, and he certainly tries to see the world from their point of view. And his novels, The Dewy Morn, for instance, or Amaryllis at the Fair, um, the central female character in both those novels is quite reminiscent of the female characters we find in Thomas Hardy. But as with Hardy, although these are independent women, they are also vulnerable, um, and they struggle to succeed in a world that seems hostile to their intentions and to their desires. So perhaps I'm going to read in a moment his description of Amaryllis Iden, who's the main character in his novel Amaryllis at the Fair. But let me first read from one of his essays. So this isn't fiction. This is fact, and he's talking about how the country people, men and women in Sussex, are generally more prosperous, better fed, better clothed, better housed than many of those he saw in Wiltshire. And he remembered how some of the women in Wiltshire, even when they were really quite a young age, maybe in their 30s, looked already quite old. And here he is describing one woman. The cheekbones like knuckles, the chin of brown stoneware, the upper lip smooth and without the short groove which should appear between lip and nostrils. Black shadows dwelt in the hollows of the cheeks and temples. There was a blackness about the eyes. The blackness gathers in the faces of the older who have been much exposed to the sun. The fibres of the skin scorched and half charred, like a stick thrust in the fire and withdrawn before the flames seize it. And then in a rather melancholy aside, he says, you know, you look at the young women, but you know that in a short space of time, their youth and their exuberance will be battered down by their harsh existence. He says, talking of a young woman, she walks in the glory of young life, yet she is really centuries old. The loveliness of 17 is centuries old. Is this why passion is almost sad? You know, this is this repeating pattern over the generations and the generations of people who have been battened down by hard work and a difficult existence. So to come to Amaryllis Iden and Amaryllis at the Fair, uh, he describes how she creates her own world away from her village society, and she finds it in the countryside, close at hand. She loved beauty for its own sake. She loved the sunlight, the grass and the trees, the gleaming water, the colours of the fields and the sky. To listen to the running water was to her a dear delight. To the wind in the high firs, or caught in the wind-stretching arms of the oak. She rested among these things. They were to her mind as sleep to the body. But she often finds herself in conflict with the local authority. Her indignation, sometimes at the wrongfulness of certain things, seemed to fill her with a consuming fire. Her contempt of sycophancy and bold independence led her constantly into trouble. Um, in The Dewy Morn, the character there is Felice Goring, and of course Goring named after Goring, where Jefferies ended up living. Now, The Dewy Morn was written before Jefferies went to his final home in Goring, but he visited it in 1870 as a young man and fallen hopelessly in love with a young girl. I don't think anything became of this relationship. It was a sort of infatuation, but that's perhaps why in his later novel he calls Felice Goring. Um, um, After the Second World War, a lot of Jefferies' writings were published by Samuel Looker through the Worthing Arts Project, and there were extracts from all his writings, including quite long extracts from the novels. And there's one description where Felice Goring goes for a swim in a pond, and she comes out, and one of the local men is looking at her and infatuated by her beauty coming out of the lake, and they put a what must have been considered in 1948 a rather risque um, illustration next to this, as you see in this picture. But apart from anything else, the woman looks far more 1940s, I think you'll agree, than 1880s. So, turning track again to a different theme in Jeffrey's writing, and this is how those who stayed in the countryside, those who didn't move into the towns, or those who didn't find work that paid them handsomely, often augmented their meager incomes through illegal activities. Now, in the earlier 19th century, we had big poaching gangs. Now, smuggling gangs. That had disappeared by Jeffrey's time, but there were large poaching gangs. So I think we're all familiar with the idea of the individual poacher who goes out in the night and comes back with a hare or two. But there were gangs, and these gangs weren't just looking for a hare or two. They were looking for dozens and dozens of hares and even more rabbits or anything else that they could kill and sell. And as the amount of poaching increases, so the number of gamekeepers employed by the big estate increases. And as this contemporary illustration shows, there were often quite desperate fights between the two, which on occasion even led to fatalities. So there is a well-known Sussex poaching song called William Taylor, about such an incident. And these songs would have been sung, but they'd have been sung in secret. They wouldn't have been sung boldly. And there is a sort of parallel existence going on in the countryside. And Jefferies explores this with some starkness in a little novella, I suppose you'd call it, The Field Play. And it's a very interesting read because when you start reading it, you think you might be reading something by Barbara Cartland. You get this description of this beautiful girl and how she's going to join the hay rakers, and she goes through a hedge and she rips part of her dress and she mends it with a thorn from a bush. And the other women chide her because she's a bit ungainly, but she's also attractive to men, and so they're a bit resentful of that. And then there's Big Matt, and Big Matt is the man who is mowing in the field with his scythe, and he's bigger and stronger than all the other men, and all the farmers want to employ him because he's a workhorse. So it all just seems like a bit of a crass romantic story. The giddy girl falling for the big, hardy, rough, sinewy, labouring man. But then the story slightly changes, and there's a moment when Dolly, that's her name, goes away from the other haymakers, and she meets Mr. Andrew. And as Jefferies tells us, in the countryside, the son of the local landowner is always called by his Christian name, but with the title of Mister. So the surname wasn't Andrew. He'd have been Mr. Andrew Farquharson or whatever it was, and and Mr. Andrew basically takes advantage of Dolly. It's not explicitly stated because this is the 1880s and you can't have sex scenes in in fiction in the 1880s. But he makes it fairly clear, what has taken place, and she becomes pregnant, and she's living with Matt, but Matt won't marry her. So in the countryside, even if you became pregnant out of wedlock, if you got married before the birth of the child, it was still considered respectable. But he won't marry her, but he lives with her, and then she has this child. And he drinks more and more. Jefferies tells us he drinks more and more, and he works more and more. And then one night, in a fury, his terrible fist crashes down on Dolly and knocks out one of her eyes. And she becomes this poor, bedraggled creature with this child that she's holding. And one day she goes up the street, and who passes her but Mr. Andrew, who doesn't recognize her. And she calls out to him, and he looks at it, half afraid, half embarrassed, thrusts half a crown into her hand, and quickly marches on, thanking that he hadn't got more involved with her than he did. And then the story moves on to Mr. Roberts, who has a small farm. And Mr. Roberts employs Dolly's brother, and he struggles. He's a farmer and he's struggling. He can't even afford insurance. He's so poor. Um, but all through the countryside at night, there are arson attacks. Barns and hayricks have been set on fire by angry men who are just angry at their situation and taking it out on the farmers and their property. And sure enough, one of his hayricks is set on fire. Um, um, Dolly's brother, working for Farmer Roberts, throws a stick at the man, knocks his hat off, and anyway, the man is later identified as Big Matt, and he's brought up for arson and he's sent down for prison for many, many years. And he makes no apology, he doesn't explain himself. He just stands there stolidly with anger and fury in his eyes. And then Dolly is pregnant again, this time through Matt, but she's wrecked. There's no one to look after her. She has no way of making an income. So they throw her into the workhouse. And you must excuse me, this is a depressing piece of writing, but it shows Jefferies at his most angry because he knows Victorian society is wealthy. He knows that no one need be poor and struggling. And this is how he ends his little story. Dolly survived, but utterly broken, hollow-chested, a workhouse fixture. Still, so long as she could stand, she had to wash in the laundry. Weak as she was, they weakened her still further with steam, heat, and labour. Washing is hard work for those who enjoy health and vigour. To a girl broken in heart and body, it is a slow destroyer. Heat relaxes all the fibres. Dolly's required bracing. Steam will soften wood and enable the artificer to bend it to any shape. Dolly's chest became yet more hollow, her cheekbones prominent. She bent to the steam. This was the girl who had lingered in the lane to help the boy pick watercress, to gather a flower, to listen to a thrush, to bask in the sunshine. Open air and green fields were to her life itself. Heart miseries are always better borne in open air. How just, how truly scientific to shut her up in a steaming workhouse. The workhouse was situated in a lovely spot, on the lowest slope of hills, hills covered afar with woods. meads at hand, cornfields further away, then green slopes over which broad cloud shadows glided slowly. The larks sang in spring, in summer the wheat was golden, in autumn the distant woods were brown and red and yellow. Had you spent your youth in those fields, had your little drama of life been enacted in them, do you not think you would like at least to gaze out at them from the windows of your prison? It was observed that the miserable wretches were always looking out of the windows in this direction. The windows on that side were accordingly built up and bricked in that they might not look out. To change the tone, Brighton. Jefferies had a love-hate relationship with Brighton. He loved the bustle. He loved the comings and goings. He loved the architecture. Interestingly, and perhaps you might think perversely, he was very much against planting trees in the streets of Brighton. He thought that the terraces and the villas were so beautiful, set against the sea and the sunshine and the backdrop of the downs, that trees were not appropriate in that setting. Here's a photograph from Jeffrey's time looking from the West Pier towards Brighton. It's a hot, sunny day. All the umbrellas are up to shield against the sunshine. And often he would go on the West Pier. Of course, the West Pier is now just a skeleton, sadly, sitting there in the sea. And whilst on the pier, he often wondered how many people who went on the pier really enjoyed the pier, really enjoyed the sea. Most people who go to the West Pier at Brighton walk at once straight to the furthest part. This is the order and custom of pier promenading. You are to stalk along the deck till you reach the end, and there go round and round the band in a circle like a horse tethered to an iron pin, or else sit down and admire those who do go round and round. No one looks back at the gradually extending beach and the fine curve of the shore. No one lingers where the surf breaks immediately above it, listening to the remorseless sigh of the dying wave as it sobs back to the sea. And again, our perception of the past. Brighton, according to Jefferies, was a smelly place, although not as bad as Hastings, which, as far as he was concerned, was the smelliest town on the south coast, probably because of all the fish that were gutted by the fishing folk, mixed with rather poor sewage disposal on a hot summer's day like we've had today. You can imagine what it was like. But he said even extending into September and October, this smell persisted. Western Road, he wrote, in autumn has stenches from it, end to end. But it is indeed sweet compared to Hastings, which in hot weather stenches everywhere, like leather dresses in Bermondsey, yea, worse, like old boots. If Brighton sins, Hastings sins 7 times 7. He really didn't like the town hall that had recently been opened in Hove, and he fumed, "The town hall at Hove is ludicrous, like the frog in the fable. £40,000, wrung in part from the poorest population in the world. To rent a house or two would have answered the purpose. The poverty of the Hove poor is astounding." So one can imagine that had Jeffreys lived another 100 years into the 1960s, he'd have been rather delighted to see Hove Town Hall burn down, as we can see in this painting. Now, my time is drawing to a close for this talk. Um, but one of Jefferies' novels, the greatest of his novels, I would really say without fear of contradiction, was this one, After London, where he imagines an England of the future, which has been hit by an environmental catastrophe and everything has broken down, and gradually nature has reclaimed most of the countryside. The beginning chapters are quite extraordinary, where in the most minute detail he describes how nature overcomes and eclipses everything that man had created in the previous centuries. Now you see that link up there, South Downs Generations, as Martin said at the beginning in his introduction, was a project run through the Friends of the South Downs. It's a great website. There's so much on it about history, folklore, literature of the South Downs. And if you go and follow that link, you'll see there's a series of little videos. And I think it's the second video is me talking about this novel on location. It's only about 17 minutes long, but it hopefully will encourage you to get a copy and to read it. And Hilaire Belloc, writing 50 years later, commented on the novel. To our own modern world, there must come vast religious reaction, or some vast religious novelty, or both. It is inevitable, for men live by religion. Yet no one speaking of the future takes this into account. I know of but one book, a book of singular genius in which the thing appears, and that is Jefferies' fine vision called After London. So to finally end the talk, let's come back to Goring, to Jefferies' last months where his health is giving up and it's clear that he won't live. Um, and if you this is C Lane Goring. Now I don't know where everyone comes from listening to this talk, but if you know Worthing, you'll know Goring, and if you know Goring, you'll know that C Lane is now just a series of residential houses. It's a dual carriageway road in the nicest sense. Still got trees down the middle, but you know, back in Jeffrey's time, it was just a trackway with a few dotted cottages, as we see there. And there were still people alive in the 1940s when the Worthing Art Project was doing all this work on Jefferies. There were still people they could speak to who remembered him, and some of these reminiscences were recorded. And I showed you that painting early of Felice Goring after she came out of the lake. This is another painting commissioned at that time showing a dying Jefferies in his garden during the summer of 1887, dictating his final words to his wife. And so I will end by reading some of these things. So it seemed to me as a boy, sweet and new like this every morning. And even now, after the years have passed and the lines have worn in the forehead, the summer meads shines as bright and fresh as when my foot first touched the grass. It has another meaning now. The sunshine and the flowers speak differently. For a heart that has once known sorrow reads behind the page and sees sadness in joy. Probably life will be one day found to be a force like electricity, quite as natural and no more supernatural than thunder and lightning. Is it thought that lives on, thought projected on into time? Not life, which is a mere force and goes like the wave on the shore, but its emotions and its thoughts that endure. These, the invisible, which and without dimensions, that exist onwards, like my memory of the camera obscura, as if the petals of the flower, its sensations of warmth, were to exist on when the petals decayed. And one of his literally last things that he dictated, he said, I wonder to myself how they can all get on without me. how they manage bird and flower without me to keep the calendar for them. Nature sets no value upon life, nor on the larks that sang years ago. The earth is all in all to me, but I am nothing to the earth. It is bitter to know this before you are dead. Um, Now, Jefferies had many admirers, and one of them was W.H. Hudson, who, though of English parents, was born in Argentina, and he returned to England. And like Jefferies, he became a regular contributor to all the magazines and periodicals that I mentioned. And he was so sorry that he never got to meet Jefferies. So 12 years after Jefferies' death in 1899, Hudson thought, I will write the book Jefferies would have written if he'd lived, his South Downs book. And he published the book Nature in Downland, Hudson's tribute really to Jefferies. And again, here's a painting that was produced for the Worthy Arts Project, where Hudson had this strange experience. He got off the train at Goring. He was walking through Goring churchyard on his way to Jefferies' house, because it was in Jefferies' house that Hudson wrote his book. On a cloudy, melancholy day in September, I came in search of this cottage, and walking to the church by a narrow lane, with a low, trim-like hedge on either side, my thoughts were of Jefferies, who had doubtless often walked here too, feeling the icy hand on him of one that walked invisible at his side. My mind was full of sadness, when hearing the crunching of gravel beneath feet other than my own, I suddenly looked up, and behold, there before me stood the man himself, back on earth in the guise of a tramp. It was a most extraordinary coincidence that at such a moment I should come face to face with this poor outcast and wanderer, who had the Jefferies countenance as I knew it from portraits and descriptions. So Jefferies' last words, this is eternity. And I'm going to leave you with one of his more hopeful quotes. If I can find, I've been able to find every quote I wanted. Make joy real now to those you love, and help forward the joy to those yet to be born. So on that positive note, I shall end my talk. Thank you.
Chris, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed that. And on a personal note, can I say that I'm enjoying working with you in your project management role, but to see this other side of you and hear, I mean, I've heard some of your folk songs and that sort of thing, but to hear you talk with such passion and enthusiasm and knowledge on your historian side, it's absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much on that personal note. We do
Thanks,
have
Martin.
time for a couple of questions, I think. I see, I don't see any hands going up.
We've had a question in the chat.
Have we?
Yeah. So, are you able to see the chat, Chris, or would you like me to read them out to you?
If you could read it, please.
So we have a question that says, "Thank you, Chris. What was it that took him in the end?"
No one's quite sure. Was it cancer, possibly? Was it consumption, TB? It is, it shows how even the late 19th century medical knowledge was still quite rudimentary. So it's not certain or clear what he actually died of.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
His death certificate said he died from chronic fibroiditis and exhaustion. He certainly died from tuberculosis, as we now call it.
Ah,
It's
right.
known as consumption or tysis in his day.
Yes, yes. Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. Certainly exhaustion. We can see in that painting, can't we, of him? He was indeed exhausted and yet only 38 years of age.
Yes, tragically cut short, as you say. What might he have written had he lived longer? I think we have to be grateful for the body of work he has left. I've never come across him before, so I'm really grateful for that insight into his short life.
Oh, what I can, and if I put the last slide here, these are all the links. So to anyone watching, I say Eloise said she'd send these out to you, but the first link that takes you to the Worthian Heritage Alliance website, and you can find all the Worthian Heritage trails on there, including the Richard Jefferies one that you can download. Then there's the Richard Jefferies Society, and they are a real repository of everything Jefferies has done. Third link is to my website. If anyone's interested in coming to any of the talks or walks that I'm doing over the next few months, you'll find them on there. And then finally, but not least, as Martin referred to the South Downs for All project, you've got the link to that.
I must thank the Richard Jefferies Society for their support as well. They publicised this talk and supported it, sharing it to their members. And I believe we had some members attending today.
Oh, excellent.
So thank you to everyone who supported us that way.
Excellent, thank you. And before we go our separate ways, I must thank Eloise for setting up all the Zoom and making sure that worked properly. So that went extremely well. So thank you, Eloise. And thank you once again, Chris. And we look forward to the next event. I think then, unless anybody had one last question, I think people may be leaving us. So I think I'll call it, draw it to an end there.
Chris, can I just ask a question?
Oh, yes, please do.
Yeah, if there was one piece of literature that he wrote as a sort of a taster to tip my toe in the water, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's got to be After London. The first two chapters are extraordinary. The later chapters, where of course it's so hard, isn't it, to depict the future. So of course he can't help but depict the future through his own experience, and so that doesn't quite work as well. But those first two chapters, when he's describing nature reclaiming the world that civilization has created, is quite remarkable. So I would recommend that.
Is it sort of readily available?
I mean, it's been republished. If it isn't currently available in a new form, you shouldn't find any problem getting it as a second-hand book. I'm sure if you looked online, you'd get a copy, all right.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say thank you. It was a great talk. Brilliant, Chris. Thank you.
Oh, very
and
kind.
Friends of the South Downs for making that available.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Chris, you may not be seeing these, but we're getting a lot of thanks coming in the chat as well, and saying what an excellent talk it was. So well done again. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll call it an end to proceedings there. Thank you, Chris, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Yeah.
Thank you.